Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about China. When we last talked about China, we were studying the Qing Dynasty, and we talked about the Qing Dynasty and the strengths of it and how Europeans had just arrived there and how the Qing Dynasty responded to that. But now we're going to talk about the second half of the Qing Dynasty, and as Europeans have industrialized and have started really expanding their empires throughout the world, how they interact with China and how China responds to that. Sometimes when I record these, it's hard for me to judge if I'm talking too fast. So please remember that this will be posted if you miss anything and you need to go back. So China was facing a lot of issues at the beginning of this time period. Again, we're studying the time period 1750 to 1900. So we talked about the beginning of the Qing Dynasty, which was back in the 1600s, but now as they're going forward, they're starting to experience some issues. So just write down a couple examples. They had an increasing gap between rich and poor. Tenant farmers were losing their land, so the poor were becoming even poorer. Their infrastructure was deteriorating. So one of the things you might remember about China is that it was historically the government's job to maintain the irrigation, and that was struggling. There was corruption of the civil service exam, so a lot of cheating and bribery going on, which meant that the best people were not necessarily getting those jobs. There was also increased government spending on private projects, which means like the emperor and other officials were spending money on themselves rather than the people. Flooding became a problem due to neglect of the irrigation systems, which resulted in the loss of farmland. So those are just some of the issues that are happening. The government is kind of becoming more corrupt. They're not taking care of the people as much, and so people, especially the poor and the peasant farmers, are starting to suffer. The first major event we're going to talk about is the Opium Wars, and to understand this, we have to remember China's relationship with the world. And so up until this point, China has kind of been where it's at. Like, they are the ones that are manufacturing products that other people want, like silk and porcelain. Remember, too, all the inventions that China had. They're very innovative. So they're really one of the leaders in the world up to this point in innovation and manufacturing. China had viewed others as that they didn't really have much to offer. So like the Europeans wanted to come in and take Chinese silk, but the Chinese didn't really feel like they had anything to gain from the Europeans because the Europeans had kind of less sophisticated goods. And so you might remember in the Ming Dynasty and then in the Qing, they really restricted Europeans coming in because they didn't feel like it benefited their society. And so because of this, the British had developed an unfavorable balance of trade, which means they were importing a lot more from China than China was buying from them. They're kind of like indebted to China, and they didn't like that. And so the British found a product that they could sell in China, which would have very high demand, which was opium. Opium is an illegal drug. There's a lot of illegal drugs today that are derived from opium. So, I mean, think about that. If a country started just importing drugs into our country, as if it was no big deal and selling it, and all these people were becoming addicted, like, we would definitely have a problem with that. And that's what happened in China. Part of the reason the British were able to do this is that opium grows in the Middle East and India, which we know is where they were establishing colonies at the time. So they were able to use that to then import the opium into China. And so opium caught on in China because people became addicted. It's a highly addicted drug. And by 1835, at least 12 million Chinese were addicted. So these are photographs of people smoking opium in China. And I mean, if you just think about this at a basic level, if millions of people now have a drug problem, it really is going to slow down the economy. It just degrades society and causes all kinds of problems in their society. So this addiction caused a decline in economic production because people aren't working when they're addicted to drugs. And so in 1839, the Qing asked the British government formally to stop selling opium, and the British refused. And so the Qing responded by seizing and destroying British stores of opium in China. So like the British had imported opium into China and was storing it in big warehouses, but that's on Chinese territory. And so the Chinese went in and seized drugs I mean, to me, similarly to how we would do in the United States, even though it's owned by someone else, it's an illegal substance, and so they seized it and destroyed it. And so the British, in response to that, attacked China, and this began a series of wars called the Opium Wars. So go ahead and pause the video here, and in your notes you have two sources you're going to look at. The first source is the letter from a Chinese official to Queen Victoria. So he's writing to the Queen of Great Britain, trying to address the opium problem, and there's a few questions to answer. And then there's also excerpts from the Treaty of Nanjing. So the Treaty of Nanjing was the treaty that settled the first set of opium wars. So you're going to read that and answer the questions. Once you've had enough time to do that, go ahead and unpause the video. So hopefully you listed some arguments that the Chinese official made in his letter. One that I find compelling is the fact that he says that opium is illegal in Britain. So if they know it's bad for people and it's not allowed in their country, why are they selling it and ruining someone else's country? And the British don't want to stop selling it, though, because they're making a lot of money. And then the Treaty of Nanjing, hopefully you see that it's very unfavorable to the Chinese. Like almost all the parts of the treaty benefit the British. So as we have finished answering those questions, we're going to move on and continue with the rest of the notes. So this is just a little review of some of the parts of the treaty that you just read. The British were able to defeat the Chinese due to better military technology, and they were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing. And so just a couple of things that are important to note in that treaty. The British gained the territory of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong actually stayed as part of Britain until the 1990s when it was transferred back to China. But that became a major important trading port in China for the British. 5 more ports were forced open to British trade. So remember, previously, the Qing had really restricted Europeans in China because they didn't feel like they really had anything to gain and they wanted to preserve their culture, but now they're forced to open up. They also granted increased privileges for Christian missionaries. That's another thing we've talked about before, that the Chinese wanted to limit Christian influence so that it didn't take away from their native religions, and now Christian missionaries can have a lot more freedom in China. And then Westerners were given extraterritorial rights. So what that means is in specific trading zones, Westerners, such as British, were exempt from Chinese laws. So think about that in terms of America too. Like if people came here to trade, but they didn't have to follow any of the American laws, I think we would have a problem with that. But that is what the Europeans, such as the British, are being given, that they don't have to follow the Chinese laws when they're there to trade. Another key concept that we've talked about before is the idea of transnational businesses or multinational businesses. So we talked about the United Fruit Company and Unilever in Africa. Another example of that is HBSC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. This grew into a major corporation, which you can tell by the photograph is still around today. But it was founded by the British in Hong Kong in 1865 to manage the money from all the opium and other trade in China. So we've talked about that in this time period, how there's just a huge growth in banking and finance throughout the world. And this is another example. So this is a result of the Industrial Revolution because all the new business of the Industrial Revolution demanded that people have like more sophisticated ways to take care of their money, like deposit money, get loans, things like that. And then it's also the result of imperialism because Europeans are developing these huge corporations that operate outside of Europe, and they operate in many different countries throughout the world. So next we're going to talk about the Taiping Rebellion. These are some of the long-term or underlying causes of the Taiping Rebellion. You can think of it as kind of the result of like all these problems building up. So you can just list a couple of these issues. China was experiencing increased population. At the same time, they were not producing enough food to feed their people, which resulted in famine. There was flooding due to the deteriorating irrigation and the government not taking care of the irrigation. And like I mentioned before, there was corruption in the exam system. So the government officials, the scholar gentry, no longer were necessarily the best chosen people out of that exam system. There was a lot of bribery and corruption. So the deterioration of the government and the suffering of the people were long-term or underlying causes of the Taiping Rebellion. So what were the immediate causes or the actual thing that started it off? The Taiping Rebellion was started by a mentally unstable peasant who proclaimed that he was the son of Jesus. So that I mentioned that only because it shows how Christianity was gaining more and more influence in China, that even though, I mean, this doesn't make sense if you're following the Christian religion that this guy is saying this, it shows that they were exposed to all of these ideas such as the Christian religion. So he started promoting this idea among the peasants that one day all Chinese would share in China's great wealth. And there's going to be like this revolution that takes place and it's going to fix these issues of poverty and increasing gap between rich and poor. And so he organized an army of peasants from southern China that eventually numbered 1 million people. And they captured the capital city of Nanjing and lots of southern China. So the kind of lavender purple area on this map is the zone that they controlled. This revolt lasted for 10 years. This was a huge deal in China. The revolt was eventually stopped by the Qing government and foreigners like the British and the French. So foreigners came in like the British and the French because they want to maintain their trade in China. And if China is in basically a civil war, that makes it much more difficult for them to conduct economic operations. And so that's why they came over to help, not just to be nice. It's because they want to be able to continue making money out of China. But think about this, if a war lasted 10 years, it's going to cause a lot of issues. So lots of destruction of farmland. At least 20 million people were killed, and nothing was solved. So they crushed the peasant army and stopped the rebellion, but none of those underlying issues were dealt with. So the Taiping Rebellion kind of caused people to recognize that maybe China needed to make some changes and some reforms. And so some people in China wanted to adopt reform, and they wanted to adopt Western ways and technology and be more interactive with the Europeans and other Westerners. Other people in China wanted to close off China and return to a more traditional society. So these people would say, all this Western influence and Christianity, this is taking away from our traditional culture and our traditional way of life, and we want to stop that. And so one person who played a really decisive role in this is the Dowager Empress Cixi. Dowager just means that her husband was the emperor and then he passed away. So she's kind of like a retired empress. However, when her son came to power, when her husband died, he was too young to rule. And so when that happens, a king or queen has to have a regent or like someone who rules in their name until they're old enough to do that. And so she gained a lot of power by serving as regent for her son and then her nephew. So she was kind of unofficially in charge of China at this time. And she backed a movement called the Self-Strengthening Movement. The overall goal of the self-strengthening movement was for China to modernize, but kind of not take it too far. So like they want to modernize and adopt things that they think are going to be good for China, but they also want to maintain their own culture. And if you think about the idea of self-strengthening, they're kind of saying like, we're going to do this ourselves and not let Europeans or other people decide what we're going to adopt. It's going to be like we're going to figure out what we're going to reform and not let anybody else tell us. So this included things like updating the education system. They sent diplomats to other countries to see how other countries ran their governments and their economy, to learn from that. And they did adopt some Western technology like updated military weapons, the telegraph, and railroads. They at the same time attempted to preserve traditional Chinese values about the family and society. So think about like the influence of Confucianism and filial piety that we've talked so much about this year. They don't want to lose those traditional elements. The problems with this is that China borrowed a lot of money from foreigners to finance this. So like we've looked at in some of these other countries, a lot of this new industrialization and new technology, it was state-sponsored instead of sponsored by individual entrepreneurs. And so they had to get this money from somewhere. And so China became indebted to a lot of foreign governments. And as Europeans and Americans came to trade more and more and more in China, they developed an unfavorable balance of trade with a lot of these other countries, which means they're importing more from those countries than they're exporting. And so there are a lot of Western nations that took advantage of the fact that the Qing Dynasty was weakening, and especially after the Opium Wars, and becoming more open to Westerners, and they forced China to sign unfavorable treaties. One of the things that resulted from this is what you see on this map. And I touched on this earlier in our imperialism PowerPoint, but I'm going to discuss it a little bit more in detail. So countries started to develop spheres of influence. A sphere of influence is a region where only a specific country is allowed to trade there. So like this is China, but you can see on the map in the orange area, only Britain is allowed to trade. In the yellow area, only France is allowed to trade. So they're kind of claiming territory for themselves, but they're not controlling the territory. They're only controlling the economy in that region. So is this imperialism? I think we would say yes. We've talked a lot about economic imperialism, and that's what's happening here. So again, the Europeans aren't actually taking over this territory. Like it's still China. But they're taking over the economy in that area. And that really affects China because China, again, previously had been a major center of manufacturing, and now all of these manufactured goods from Europe are flooding into China. Just like in India, where we talked about how India had a really successful cotton textile industry, and then it was put out of business by all these cheap European products. That's what happens in China now too. They have produced all of these really high quality goods, and now people are being put out of business by all these imported factory-made products from Europe. Now, one of the other countries that had an issue with this was the United States, because the United States saw these spheres of influence and was worried that Europeans were going to try to actually colonize China. And so the United States issued what was called the open door policy, which said China should be like an open door, meaning China should not be formally taken over by foreign powers. So people can still trade in China, but they're saying nobody should be allowed to actually colonize China, as Europeans did, like in Africa, for example, where they fully took it over. The U.S. is doing this really because the U.S. wants to be able to keep trading in China, and so the U.S. was concerned that if it was colonized, it would cut off that trade for all the other countries that were not part of the colonization. So there were people who thought that China still needed further reform, but the Qing government was really reluctant to do this because remember, they're trying to balance adopting reforms that will be positive while still maintaining traditional Chinese culture. And so the Dowager Empress Cixi especially resisted more change, and she actually imprisoned her young nephew, who she served as regent for, when he attempted more reform. There was a growing backlash in China about the special privileges given to foreigners. So remember earlier I talked about the extraterritorial rights, how a lot of the Europeans didn't have to follow Chinese laws when they were in China. And then also remember, there's just like a flood of Christian missionaries coming into China. And so this eventually led to a revolt called the Boxer Rebellion. So for what led to it again, I would say the growing influence of Europeans, which a lot of Chinese did not like. So why is it called the Boxer Rebellion? The Boxers were members of a secret society in China And they practiced martial arts, which they believed would grant them special powers, such as like being invincible in the face of European bullets. So think about, in terms of, it says in your paper, synthesis, what we can compare this to what we can compare the Boxer Rebellion to. So think about all the examples of religion being used to try to resist European imperialism. I'll give you a minute. Think about one of those things and write it down as an example. So the Boxers were upset by foreign takeover and especially disliked Christian missionaries. And so in 1900, the Boxers started roaming around China, killing Christian missionaries and also executing Chinese Christians, like people in China who had converted to Christianity. And so it's another example of the rebellion in the face of all this westernization trying to come into China. Just like we saw with the Taiping Rebellion, Western countries attacked China to stop the rebellion, and the Chinese were forced to pay an indemnity, which means like damages for the destruction that's been caused and for the Christian missionaries who had been killed. And so the Boxer Rebellion was another demonstration of how the Chinese people felt about Western influence within their country. So what are the lasting effects of the Boxer Rebellion? Nationalism increased after the crush of the Boxer Rebellion. So Chinese, more than ever, are feeling like we need to maintain our own culture. We're Chinese. We don't want to be British or American or French or whatever. And we need to stand up and fight for China. The government attempted reforms. They tried to create a constitutional monarchy rather than this like imperial state that they'd had. But it was kind of too little too late. And the Qing dynasty was overthrown in 1911 by the Nationalist Party led by a leader named Sun Yat-sen. And they established China from that point on as a republic. And a republic is a government where there's no king. And here's a political cartoon about this. So you can see these are European leaders, well, not all European, dividing up China as if it's like a pie or a pizza. On the left is Queen Victoria of Britain. In the middle, he represents Germany. Then we have Russia, and then we have Japan. And we're going to talk about Japan soon and how they became an imperialist nation as well. So the activity that you're going to do to recap information about the Qing dynasty is called Autopsy of an Empire. So I'm going to go over some instructions. I would encourage you to make notes on your paper as I go over these instructions so that you can kind of remember what you're supposed to do if you come back to this later. Things that would be helpful to use. You could look up Qing Dynasty in the AMSCO book. You could use the PowerPoint notes that we just took. You could also use the reading guide. I would highly encourage that. For the patient history part, you're probably going to want to use previous notes. So we had notes that were called Qing Dynasty Past the Page. That would be helpful for the patient history. So what this is you're going to pretend that this person is the Qing Dynasty. So they have passed away as the Qing Dynasty has fallen, and you're going to examine what happened. That's why it's called an autopsy. So you're going to come up with a creative name. You're going to write the patient history. This is what you might want to make a note of. The patient history is supposed to be describing the empire in the good times. So that's why I said you're going to have to look back, because pretty much everything I talked about today was not good. You're going to have to look back to the Qing Dynasty when it was doing better, such as on the Qing Dynasty Past the Page notes, and explain what their strengths were. So talk about their government, their economy, what they were good at in the early times. That's the patient history. Then around the body of the person, you're going to illustrate creatively 5 causes of decline or death of the empire. The causes should have some kind of illustration on the body, so they should be related to an ailment, but then you also have to explain the real history part that it relates to. So this example is from the fall of the Roman Empire from a previous year. So let me give you some examples, okay? When you look at the person's body, they're kind of like cut in half. So he has this scar or stitches across his body. And so the person illustrated that. And then it says, this represents when Rome was split into eastern and western regions to try to preserve the empire and keep it from falling. So you have to illustrate something that's an ailment or an illness and then tie it to something historical. Then in the autopsy of the brain, they discovered that the brain was rapidly atrophying, and it says this represents the corrupt government and the constant turnover of rulers. They also depicted weakening of the muscles, and then they related that to the decline of the Roman military through the use of mercenary soldiers. So you have to come up with some creative things to illustrate what's going on to the Qing dynasty and why it's fallen, and then illustrate them and relate it back to a specific historical fact. You can pause if you want to pause the video at this time, so you can leave this example up on the screen and you can come up and look at it if you feel like you need more information. But to recap, patient history is describing the empire in the good times, and then the bottom part, you're going to illustrate 5 causes of why the empire fell, and make sure you include specific facts in your annotations.